On October 15, 1946, Hermann Göring, the Nazi minister, ended his life with a cyanide pill, evading what he saw as an even more humiliating fate, the gallows. Barely 24 hours later, 10 of his comrades faced that same fate in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, condemned for crimes that redefined evil in modern history. These men were not merely soldiers or politicians. They were the architects of a regime that unleashed unprecedented horror across Europe and the world. Yet their punishment did not end with their deaths. The Allied powers took extreme measures to ensure that even their remains could not serve as symbols for future followers. Today, we delve into the final fate of these men's bodies, a secret zealously guarded for decades. Why was it necessary to erase every trace of their existence? What steps were taken to ensure that no relics or remnants of their legacy remained? Immerse yourself in this unsettling story that reveals how, even in death, the world fought to extinguish the flames of their ideology. Welcome to Wartime Archive. The end of the war. Since taking power in 1933, Adolf Hitler began implementing a systematic plan to ensure what he called the purity of the German race. This plan, known as the Final Solution, involved the physical extermination of the entire Jewish population in Europe. To carry it out, concentration and labor camps were established, as well as ghettos where Jews were confined under inhumane conditions. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the Nazis intensified these extermination policies. Mobile killing units and special battalions were deployed to carry out mass murders. Millions of people were deported to ghettos and extermination camps, where gas chambers were used to end hundreds of lives in a matter of minutes. These atrocities continued until the end of the war, when Allied forces captured Berlin and brought the Nazi regime to an end. With the collapse of the Third Reich, the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, known as the Big Three, sought to bring the perpetrators of Nazi war crimes to justice. Initially, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin proposed executing captured Nazi leaders without a trial. However, Franklin D. Roosevelt and later Harry S. Truman advocated for the idea of an international trial. This process aimed not only to punish the guilty, but also to expose to the entire world the magnitude of the atrocities committed, especially in the extermination camps. Thus, the International Military Tribunal, IMT, was established, composed of judges from the 4 Allied nations: the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The trials were held in Nuremberg, a city rich in symbolism for the Nazi Party. Nuremberg was not only the site of the party's annual rallies, but also where the infamous racist laws of 1935 were enacted, stripping Jews of their German citizenship. Additionally, the city was located in Bavaria, the heartland of Nazism, where Hitler had launched his movement. These reasons, along with the availability of suitable facilities, made Nuremberg the ideal location for the trials. The tribunal presented 4 main charges against the defendants: conspiracy to commit aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 24 of the most prominent leaders of the Nazi regime were brought to trial, although some, like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler, had already committed suicide. The proceedings began on November 20, 1945, just over 6 months after Germany's surrender, and marked a milestone in international criminal law. Each Allied nation contributed 2 judges and a team of prosecutors, with Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence of Great Britain presiding. The tribunal, groundbreaking for its time, featured simultaneous translations in English, German, Russian, and French, using a judicial system that combined elements from the legal systems of all 4 nations. Over nearly a year, the IMT exposed the world to the crimes of the Nazi regime, establishing precedents that would forever change the way war crimes and crimes against humanity are prosecuted. The defendants. Before the trials could begin, 2 crucial issues needed to be resolved: deciding who would be prosecuted, and ensuring they were captured and taken into custody. As is well known, some of the most prominent Nazi leaders took their own lives before they could be captured, while others managed to escape, mostly to South America. Rudolf Hess had already been imprisoned in England since 1941, but American, Soviet, and British soldiers were still feverishly searching among the ruins of German cities for the remaining perpetrators. One of those captured was Robert Ley, who almost succeeded in evading the authorities. He fled to Berchtesgaden, near the Austrian border, but was eventually apprehended on May 16, 1945. Ley had been the head of the German Labor Front from 1933 to 1945, and a high-ranking Nazi official with a reputation for corruption and abuse of power. He exploited the benefits of the Westdeutsche Beobachter newspaper to enrich himself and embezzled funds from the German Labor Front, amassing a fortune that included villas, cars, and works of art. Although his power diminished after the war began, he was involved in the mistreatment of slave laborers and was aware of the regime's plans for the extermination of Jews. After his capture, Ley was sent to the detention center nicknamed Ashkan, located at the Grand Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg. In August 1945, he was transferred to Nuremberg, along with other prisoners to face trial. However, before he could be prosecuted, Ley managed to commit suicide by hanging himself with a wet towel in his cell bathroom. This event prompted the Allied forces to increase surveillance of the detainees, implementing 24-hour guards to prevent further suicides. Although 24 individuals were initially charged, only 21 took their place in the dock. Robert Ley was already dead, Martin Bormann could not be located, and Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was declared medically unfit to stand trial due to paralysis and senility. Krupp had been accused of using slave labor in his factories and manufacturing illegal weapons, but he never faced justice. The 21 defendants present at the trial represented a range of positions within the Nazi regime. Among them were Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's designated successor until his flight to Scotland in 1941, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Foreign Minister, Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Chief of the Security Police, Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologist, Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, Wilhelm Frick, Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and Julius Streicher, founder of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. Others included Walter Funk, Minister of Finance, Hjalmar Schacht, former Reichsbank president, Karl Donitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, Erich Raeder, Admiral Inspector of the Navy, Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, Fritz Sauckel, in charge of slave labor, Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff, Franz von Papen, who helped Hitler rise to power, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, responsible for occupied Netherlands, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, Konstantin von Neurath, Foreign Minister, and Hans Fritzsche, head of the radio division in the Ministry of Propaganda. Although not all the defendants had directly participated in the final solution, they held positions of power that made them responsible for facilitating the crimes of the Nazi regime. Among them, Franz von Papen had not been in Europe for much of the war, but his prior role in bringing Hitler to power placed him under the tribunal's scrutiny. The trial began on November 20, 1945, and was initially scheduled to last 4 months, but ultimately extended to 10. During this time, 403 public sessions were held in 4 languages with simultaneous translation, an unprecedented achievement in legal history. At the trial's conclusion, 11 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, Julius Streicher, Fritz Sauckel, Alfred Jodl, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and Martin Bormann, the latter convicted in absentia as his body was never found. Although some suspected Bormann was dead, others were unconvinced, so he was tried nonetheless. This process marked a milestone in the history of international criminal law, establishing that even the most powerful leaders are not above the law. Sentence and execution of the condemned. After 315 days of trial, the sentences were announced in the afternoon of October 1st, 1946. Judge Lawrence began with Hermann Göring, widely regarded as the most dangerous of the group and responsible for the worst crimes. Upon hearing the sentence, Göring remained expressionless for a moment, then turned and left the courtroom without a word. The judge then continued reading the sentences. In addition to the 10 sentenced to hanging, the International Military Tribunal sentenced Hess, Funk and Raeder to life imprisonment. Von Schirach and Speer received 20-year sentences. Von Neurath, 15 years, and Donitz was sentenced to only 10 years in prison. Some of them would be released in the 1950s, while Hess remained incarcerated until his self-inflicted death in 1987. Hitler's top military officers, Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, accepted their death sentences but requested to be executed by firing squad, arguing that it was a method more befitting their military rank. Both requests were denied. Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, expressed his preference to be hanged rather than serve a life sentence, but his request was also denied. In the days that followed, the condemned discussed their final appeals with their lawyers, submitting them to the Allied Control Council, the only body with the authority to reduce or commute the sentences. On October 9th, the Council, composed of representatives of the 4 occupying powers, met in London to deliberate on the petitions. After 3 hours of debate, the Council rejected all appeals. On October 13th, the prisoners were informed that their last hope had vanished. The International Military Tribunal had formally concluded its work on October 1st, 1946, after pronouncing the sentences. From then on, the condemned prisoners were placed under the custody of the 4 powers military government, the Allied Control Authority headquartered in Berlin, which oversaw the coordination of the executions. On October 15th, a day before the scheduled execution, Hermann Göring made a decision that altered the plans. That night, he wrote a letter to the Allied Control Council in which he categorically rejected being hanged, calling it humiliating. In the same letter, he compared his act to that of General Hannibal, stating that he preferred to die on his own terms. After writing his message, he ingested a cyanide pill he had managed to conceal and died at 10:44 p.m. A guard heard choking sounds and attempted to intervene, but it was too late. Hours later, at 1:11 a.m. on October 16th, the executions began. Joachim von Ribbentrop was the first to be taken to the gymnasium of the Palace of Justice, where a gallows had been specially prepared for the event. When offered the chance to say his last words, Ribbentrop declared, "I wish peace for the world." His head was covered with a black hood, the noose was placed around his neck, and when the trapdoor opened, his life ended within minutes. One after another, the remaining condemned followed the same path. By 2:45 a.m., all the condemned had been executed, and their bodies rested on stretchers in the gymnasium. The executions were marked by a sense of solemnity and justice, but also by deficiencies in the process. The executioner, John C. Woods, used a short drop that did not ensure a quick death, resulting in several of the condemned dying slowly from strangulation. Despite these irregularities, the event marked the end of the darkest chapter of the Nazi regime and sealed the fate of those who had been the primary architects of terror. Perhaps Hermann Göring's decision to ingest cyanide spared him a humiliating death. According to eyewitnesses, the executions on the Nuremberg gallows were a cruel and agonizing spectacle. This was largely due to the incompetence of the designated executioner, John C. Woods. Even in his personal appearance, Woods did not inspire confidence. He rarely shaved or polished his shoes, his trousers were poorly pressed, and he always looked disheveled. However, he was the only available executioner in the European theater during that period. The Nuremberg executions were a defining moment for Woods, who enjoyed the attention he received as the executioner of the top Nazi war criminals. In the gymnasium of the Palace of Justice, he had 3 black-painted wooden gallows installed, designed to be used alternately in case of technical failures. Each gallows had 13 steps, and the ropes were replaced for each execution. The base of the gallows was partitioned on 3 sides and covered with a dark curtain to conceal the struggles of the condemned. After Joachim von Ribbentrop's death, the next to be led to the gallows was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Initially, the prisoners were to be escorted without restraints, but after Göring's suicide, the rules changed and their hands were bound with leather straps. Keitel maintained his military composure until the end, looking at the spectators while asking God for mercy for the German people. Woods pulled the lever, and Keitel fell through the trap door. While the bodies of von Ribbentrop and Keitel hung, a brief pause was allowed for those present to step out and smoke. Behind the dark curtains covering the gallows, 2 doctors, one American and one Russian, checked the pulses of the executed before officially declaring their deaths. Next to be taken to the gallows was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the Austrian SS leader who had overseen numerous mass killings in Nazi concentration camps. Kaltenbrunner had been Adolf Eichmann's superior, the principal architect of the final solution, who at the time was hiding in South America, and Rudolf Höss, the infamous Auschwitz commandant. Höss had been captured by British forces in northern Germany and had testified at the Nuremberg trials, confessing responsibility for the deaths of between 2 and 3 million Jews at Auschwitz. However, Höss was not tried at Nuremberg, but later. After Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Rosenberg was led to the gallows. As one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party, Rosenberg was known as the regime's chief ideologist. He uttered no last words and his execution was swift. Although he had declared himself an atheist, a Protestant chaplain prayed alongside him as John C. Woods pulled the lever. After a brief pause, it was Hans Frank's turn, known as Hitler's Gauleiter or Governor-General of occupied Poland. According to witnesses, Frank was the only one of the condemned who smiled as he entered the gymnasium. Some said he seemed relieved, as if welcoming the end of his suffering. The next to be executed was Wilhelm Frick, who had been Hitler's Minister of the Interior from 1933 to 1943, before being appointed governor of Bohemia and Moravia. Frick was one of the chief proponents of the Action T4 program, which implemented the mass euthanasia of people deemed racially inferior. After his death, it was Julius Streicher's turn, the editor of Der Stürmer, a newspaper that spread extreme anti-Semitic propaganda. When Woods pulled the lever, the trapdoor opened forcefully, but Streicher began kicking as he fell. The rope failed to break his neck, and Streicher hung, struggling for breath. According to witnesses, Woods stepped down from the platform and disappeared behind the curtain covering the body. Shortly afterward, the groans ceased, indicating that Streicher had been manually strangled. It is unclear whether Woods acted deliberately or due to inexperience, but it was not the only botched execution that night. Fritz Sockel, who had overseen the vast Nazi slave labor system, also suffered a prolonged death. He shouted his innocence as he was led to the gallows, but, like Streicher, he took a long time to die at the end of the rope, leaving witnesses shocked. The penultimate to be executed was Alfred Jodl, who wore his Wehrmacht uniform with the collar slightly raised. Finally, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the last of the condemned, limped up the 13 steps to the gallows due to his clubfoot. At 2:45 a.m., Seyss-Inquart fell through the trapdoor, marking the end of the executions. As Woods cut the final rope, he appeared satisfied with his work. Alongside American soldiers, he carried the last body to the corner of the gymnasium, where stretchers had been prepared for the corpses. At that moment, guards also brought out an 11th body, covered with a U.S. Army blanket, the corpse of Hermann Göring. These executions were far from regular. Much speculation surrounds Wood's inexperience, as he used a short drop instead of a longer one that would have ensured quick deaths by breaking the neck. Consequently, many of the hanged men, such as Jodl and Keitel, took up to 20 minutes to die from strangulation. This was not only inhumane for the condemned, but also a traumatic experience for those who witnessed the executions. The fate of the bodies. Until now, everything we have seen is well-known history. What had been largely ignored until very recently, when certain documents were declassified, are the events that followed the executions. The fate of the bodies of the Nazi criminals executed in Nuremberg was considered a top-level secret by the United States government, which carried out the operation for their disposal. At the time, rumors circulated that the corpses had been taken to the Dachau concentration camp for cremation, but this turned out to be a deliberate lie. What really happened remained in the shadows for much longer. The main reason for this secrecy was to avoid any possibility of martyrdom, a central pillar of the Nazi regime. Thus, when the Nuremberg war criminals were executed on October 16, 1946, the Allied Control Council ensured that no trace remained that could be used to venerate them or turn them into symbols. Although the bodies were photographed to document the executions, the ACC ordered that the negatives be rigorously guarded and prohibited their publication in the German press. After the executions, the corpses were placed on 11 stretchers, carefully labeled and photographed one last time. These images, some of which can be found on the internet, show the rawness of the executions and confirm that they were not clean. The bodies were then placed in coffins, also labeled, though with false names to mislead any curious onlookers. For example, Hermann Göring's coffin was marked with the name George Munger, a famous American football player at the time. The coffins, including an empty 12th one, were loaded onto military trucks and escorted by American jeeps. The soldiers transporting the coffins believed they were carrying the remains of comrades who had fallen in battle during the war. The military convoy traveled south, covering more than 170 kilometers to reach the crematorium located in Ostfriedhof, one of Munich's largest cemeteries. This location was chosen for its capacity to perform multiple cremations simultaneously without arousing suspicion. Crematorium workers were told that the bodies were those of recently recovered American soldiers from the battlefield. Thus, the cremation of the 11 bodies was carried out over the course of an entire day. At the end of the process, the ashes were placed in urns, each labeled with their corresponding false identities. These urns were then transported to a U.S. Army morgue at Villa Oberhummer, a confiscated property on Heilmannstrasse 25. There, morgue operators were instructed to dispose of the ashes in a location where they could never be found. The military escort vanished into the night after completing their mission. The next day, October 17th, the urns were taken to the Vensbach stream, a tributary of the Isar River, which in turn flows into the Danube. There, each urn was opened and its contents poured into the waters. To ensure no trace remained, the urns themselves were destroyed, though declassified documents do not specify whether they were also thrown into the stream. The meticulous planning behind this operation aimed to prevent neo-Nazis from using the ashes as relics or places of worship. The fate of the possessions of the executed followed a similar logic. All insignia, medals, and uniforms were destroyed. Gold and silver items were melted down for resale to cover the costs of the executions. While most decorations were mutilated, some soldiers managed to smuggle small items as souvenirs, which reappeared decades later in auctions and private collections. On the other hand, personal belongings and amounts of money less than 1,000 Reichsmarks were returned to the families of the executed, while any greater sums were transferred to the financial offices of the International Military Tribunal. This level of meticulous planning reflects the determination of the Allied powers to completely erase any possibility of the executed being remembered as martyrs. Other bodies. But the story of the Nuremberg bodies does not end there. In addition to the main Nazi leaders executed after the initial trials, another 200 Nazis were convicted and executed in the 12 subsequent trials. Although most of them were simply cremated and their ashes scattered into rivers, some stories related to their remains are surprisingly peculiar. One notable example is Robert Ley, who committed suicide before standing trial. Ley had been examined by Dr. Douglas Kelly, the psychologist assigned to Nuremberg, who suspected that Ley suffered from a mental illness. Fascinated by his case, Kelly made a macabre decision. Before Ley's body was sent to the crematorium, he secretly opened his head and removed his brain to preserve it as a specimen. This act was not revealed until 2013, long after Kelly's death, when fragments of Ley's brain tissue were discovered among the doctor's belongings. Kelly also ended up taking his own life. Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, testified during the first Nuremberg trials, admitting to overseeing the deaths of millions of people. However, he was not tried there. Instead, he was extradited to Poland, where he faced trial for his crimes and was sentenced to death by hanging. His execution was the last public hanging in Polish history, carried out in front of the extermination camp he had once commanded. After his death, his body was secretly cremated, and the ashes were scattered in a nearby river. The fate of Martin Bormann, on the other hand, remained a mystery for decades. His disappearance in May 1945 fueled rumors that he had escaped to South America, the United States, or even other places. He was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. However, in 1963, a revealing testimony provided clues. Albert Krumnow, a retired postman, claimed to have buried 2 bodies under Soviet orders in Berlin shortly after the war ended. Although an initial excavation found nothing, in 1972, construction workers discovered human remains near the indicated location. Dental analyses and other forensic tests identified one of the bodies as Bormann and the other as Ludwig Stumpfeger, his personal doctor. Fragments of glass found in their jaws suggest that both died after ingesting cyanide. German authorities officially confirmed Bormann's death in 1973, but did not allow the cremation of his remains until DNA testing in 1998 definitively confirmed his identity. His ashes were scattered in the Baltic Sea in 1999. Although the events surrounding the Nuremberg executions and the stories of its protagonists are filled with horrors and tragedies, they also reveal the deliberate efforts of the Allied forces to erase any possibility of these Nazi criminals being turned into martyrs or symbols of worship. These decisions, though controversial, reflect the determination to prevent the hatred and ideology they represented from persisting into the future.